Hello, I'm Andy Schmuckler, a man on a mission. I'm going to be talking about the topic, how I manage not to hate anybody, uh, which has got a certain relationship to the mission, but it's more peripheral than some things. It's got to do with how we understand this world that we live in and the play of cause and effect. But before I do that, let me just say something about the mission. I have an integrated understanding of the human situation that I've been working on my entire adult life, which I actually do believe could have a beneficial impact on the human future, but only if it got out into the thinking of our civilization widely enough to have that beneficial impact. I don't know how widely enough is, but I know that what I've achieved on this mission so far, starting with, let's see, you have this The Parable of the Tribes, The Problem of Power and Social Evolution, which came out in 1984 from the University of California Press. I know that there is something that has not yet been achieved, and I feel like even if I don't have much chance of getting it out there well enough to have that impact, I got to do everything I can to try. I'm less than 2 weeks from my 78th birthday, and I'm not going to be able to fight this fight, indefinitely. That much is clear. So here I am, working in this medium that's new to me, to reach people who would want to understand the forces at work in the human world that I think put some important things in an importantly different light, gives us a different understanding of what we are by nature and what has happened to us, why why the history of our human civilization is as tormented and destructive as it has been. I claim that I can prove that the ugliness we see in human history is not human nature writ large. Now, I'm looking for people who would want to know if that was true. When I say a better human story, I mean a couple of things. I mean, first of all, I think it's more valid than the way people generally understand some important questions, how they answer them. But the other kind of better is that I think that we are engaged in a struggle of sorts as a species, about the situation we plunged into when we stepped across out of the niche in which we evolved biologically and stepped onto the path of civilization, inventing our own way of life. I think that there's something important to see there that shows that what has happened to us and what we have become has to be understood differently from how we've been understanding it. And it shows, essentially it gives a clearer map of what the battlefield is, whether which will the outcome of that battle that I'm talking about is whether human civilization will get its act together well enough and soon enough to survive on this planet for the long haul, or whether we'll destroy ourselves. That's as far as I want to go about the mission right now. A lot of what's to come will bear upon it, but I want to talk about, just shift gears. With that, understanding what it is that I'm really about. I've had several experiences in my life that have transformed me, one way or another, with spiritual, whatever you want to mean by that, implications. And one of them had to do with how I believe I got to the place where I don't hate people, even the worst, Of all the, whatever, 4 or 5 experiences I had that sort of really changed how I saw things or how I experienced things or whatever, only one was it something that I essentially thought myself into. I was 14, and I don't recall what stimulated this way of thinking, but I came to recognize that, and this is premised on the idea that I believe in cause and effect being what governs the world. I mean, that's how things work. And I saw that the implication of that was that free will, as it is generally understood, like when people of a religious bent are asked, uh, why is there evil? Um, the answer in the biblical tradition is usually along the lines of God created us with free will, and there in the garden, Adam and Eve freely chose wrong. And we've been suffering the punishments of that ever since. The idea of original sin, that, we had a choice. We could have done something different. Um, and then I was thinking it through at this time, when I was asked in ninth grade about what I wanted to be when I grew up. I was more likely to be a mathematician than whatever you want to call what I've become. But it was almost like Euclidean. If a person is born in a particular situation, the person's not responsible for what they were born into. I mean, that happens to each of us. Certain family, certain time in history, certain society, a complex gestalt of a bunch of things. We're just plunged into it. Okay. And then what about the baby as it's born? Is it responsible right now for what it is? I mean, it started out as, a fertilized egg, a sperm and an ova coming together. Was it responsible for any of that? What it was that came together? Was it, at what point did it freely choose anything between that point and when it gets born? Oh, I couldn't think of anything, but we presumably, if there is free will, there comes a time when this creature is choosing freely. So I think that you got to watch how things unfold in time, and that sort of provides some kinds of Euclidean truths. You start out with this, and then how do you get to that? Like algebra, practically. So we've got a baby born into a situation it didn't choose, and in a body with all of what's in there. Its natural inclinations, its predispositions, and its species nature, and all the stuff that is there. Didn't choose that either. So let's say we go along from there. He's not responsible at that point. He becomes a responsible person in the free will sense of the thing as soon as he starts making choices freely. So let's look at that first choice, whatever it is. It could be having to do with biting the nipple or something. Okay, well, if there was a choice, where did that choice reside? I mean, what would be different that would lead this little creature to choose A and rather than B? Oh, it's his free will. Well, where did that come from? If it's a cause, what is it the effect of? There's no way. Like in mathematics, if it can't be true of P, or it can't be true of P plus 1, well, it can't be true. There's no way that we can see ourselves as having created ourselves. We are the fruit of the world. We are born with a design that was the result of a biological evolution and the chance coming together of two particular packets of DNA. We didn't choose that stuff. And we're born into a world where we're going to have certain kinds of experiences. in our family and in our schools and with our peers, and maybe being said, having this or that happen to our society as a whole. And all those things are going to make us into something, who we are. But where did we begin to choose any of that? You can't get there. Not in a world that's ruled by cause and effect. And I got to confess, I am so wedded to the idea that everything has a cause that ever since I found out about quantum mechanics, or at least, was found out something that I think was, it's really kind of mind-boggling stuff. But the particular thing I'm thinking about is, and I talk with some physicists about this, because I don't like being disturbed by things that don't make sense according to my assumptions. So I'm just telling you, yeah, I've got an assumption about cause and effect. And what they told me, physicists, is that if you've got a bunch of atoms that are, some of which are, like uranium or something, that are going to break down. What's that word that in physics? They're going what 236 is 238 is going to turn into U-236 or something, some kind of breaking down that radioactivity is all about. That there's nothing, they said, that is different about the one that's going to break down to the one that's not. There is no cause, and I am very disturbed by that. Nobody's ever said that even if I've watched people on the sort of the countercultural left try to make use of basic physics stuff to extrapolate up into the human world, and like the Tao of Physics was a big book. I don't think that works. I think even if I have to grant that my belief in causality is doesn't cover the whole shebang all the way down to the quantum level, there's no way I don't think that gets up to the point where you can say, when so-and-so did evil, he is ultimately responsible for that. He is making choices. I don't deny that we make choices. I'm always thinking about my choices, and I try very hard to make the right choices. So choice is a big deal. And we do it all the time. That's part of being a human. And I think we're not the only creatures that make choices, but it's a lot more embedded in our existence. And I believe in the importance of looking at our choices and choosing the right thing. All I'm saying is, at that ultimate level, like as if you're going to explain evil coming into the world, in spite of having an almighty God who is also all good and all omniscient and omnipotent, how do you explain evil? I've read the theologians, for 2,000 years have been struggling with that. The Book of Job is, well, they don't deal with it philosophically, but the Christian theologians, 1,000 years ago were struggling with this and coming up with these answers that just don't make sense. Partly because this whole thing, God created us with free will. The free will, you can say, well, Schmuckler, that's my last name, you're just overly deterministic, as if there's only one way. And if you knew exactly what's going on at T1, then a perfect genius could easily, or could deduce, I don't know how easily, what the situation will be, the next increment of time, T2 we'll call it, and so on, T3, and all the way up, the deterministic universe where everything is a function of the instant that goes before, and so far into the future could be deduced. I don't know about that kind of determinism. But I've watched people, thinkers, some of them whom are famous and been famous for 2,000 years, like Lucretius, a Roman. Um, he wrote The Nature of Things. It was in Latin, the title, and I could take a stab at it, but I never did study Latin. Lucretius tried to introduce indeterminacy into the world as a way of, I mean, I can't remember if he's trying to salvage free will too. I think he was, yeah, because when I wrote something in critique of it decades ago, I said, he said, every once in a while there's a random swerve. I mean, everything's just molecules. I mean, he didn't use the word molecule, but he is famous for having seen the world as having being made up of atoms of some sort. So he's famous for that, and I don't know if that's like a genius insight or a lucky stroke, but anyway, he's an atomist before science caught up with this and established it. 18th century, 19th century, certainly 20th century. So he says that there are these molecules in motion, and that's everything. And it's like a game of billiards, and balls are hitting other balls, and everything's going off in the directions that could have been calculated in advance, except every once in a while there's a random motion. He was looking for a way out of the determinism that I was describing. His rational ideas led him to determinism, but he was looking for a way to say, no, there's free will. And the free will gets built by these occasional random motions of atoms. For a smart guy, it's not all that impressive a move, I don't think. And I'll tell you why I don't think so. Even if you want to grant him this random stuff, how do you get from there to saying that when Adam and Eve or anybody becomes what they become, that there is this free will that somehow is not a function of any kind of causality that's part of them and that's running the show? I don't think there is any sensible way. There's another book, and I should have looked this up knowing I was going to talk about it. There's a book called Swerve, and was it Michael Lewis that wrote it? Well, anyway, the book is called Swerve, and it attempts to do the same thing, and with equal failure. I think that the logic is not violated even by a little bit of atomic swerving. We are the fruit of the world. We are born with what we didn't choose that makes us up. We're born into a situation we didn't choose, and we get shaped into the beings we are, for better and for worse. And that's under that insight when I was 14 really upset me. I mean, I was obsessed with it for 2 weeks, and the reason I was obsessed was that my trip as this young fellow, with a very high N achievement, as they called it back in the 50s. A guy named David McClellan studied the world in terms of what cultures had a big need for achievement. And I recognize myself right away. I have always had a big N achievement. I would have loved to have achieved things like hitting grand slam home runs in the bottom of the ninth. I tried all I could to get to be a big athletic star. But anyway, one way or another, I really wanted to achieve. And my whole trip, I don't mean my whole trip, but a big core of my trip. And it's still in there. I mean, I really do want to do a good job when I'm out here performing. My whole trip at that time was, I want to do things that are great, or at least really good, excellence, anyhow. And I also want to behave admirably as a human being in this world. I was pretty much of a goody two shoes. I never got into much trouble until I started breaking through into this better human story when I was 24. Or actually, when I saw that the world was such a mess and tried to understand why. That's when I started being more like an adolescent, though I was in my early 20s. But anyhow, my whole trip was to perform well and to be a good guy and to get appreciation for my achievements and love for my being a good guy. And underneath all that, there was a sense of taking credit, do creditable things and take credit. Like, if I weren't doing good, I'm to blame in every ultimate sense. If I do good, I get the credit for it in an ultimate sense. And all of a sudden, that ultimate sense was taken away by this breakthrough insight into the fact that this idea of free will doesn't make sense. Yeah, we do get to choose, and it's not like I mean, in Lawrence of Arabia, there's a kind of determinism that I am not advocating, which is, somehow it is written on the books someplace. There's a guy that Lawrence goes way out of his way to save, though the Arabs would not have him do that, and they are not delighted that he saves this guy's life. And then later, something happens that is such a serious violation of what Lawrence needs to enforce in the order of this military force that he's leading toward Aqaba, if I recall. And it's the same guy. I mean, he's already determined whoever it is, I have to execute him, or however it gets put. And it's the same guy that he saved. And so the Arabs say it was written, like no matter what you do, the outcome is going to be the same. And I don't believe any of that. I don't believe in that. I am big on calling people to press the battle. I think part of my mission is having to do with American democracy being endangered by a rising force of fascism. I've been on that mission for full time for 20 years. So I think it's really important what we do. It's just that what we do is not outside the realm of causality. There are causes. We don't have to think about, well, what made me inclined to do this rather than that. We can think about it, but we really, the business at hand right now is to do the right thing. It's not like in Lawrence of Arabia where no matter what we do, we're fated to have the same outcome. Something came to me, a Sufi story about a guy is tilling a field, and this figure walks by and looks at him really funny, and he sees that this figure is death. And I don't remember what they said about how he knew it was death, and he could see that death was coming for him. So he fled, and he went to Bokhara, or whatever the city was that they designated in this Sufi tale, and to hide away so death wouldn't find him. And then, lo and behold, he encounters again this figure of death, and he asks death that's going to take him, why were you looking at me so funny? And death says, oh, I was just surprised to see you there. I knew that you and I had an appointment here in Bokhara today. So that's a kind of determinism I'm not advocating. We are in some sense, responsible to make our right choices, even if the person who makes the choices is something that's ultimately to be understood as the fruit of the world. There's a Christian idea that I like a lot. I don't know if I'm using it entirely in a kosher way, pardon the mixture of religious allusions, but what was it? There but for the grace of God go I. I once was having dinner, this is back maybe 40 years ago, 40 couple anyhow. And we were, there's a group of people, not all of whom I knew well. And the woman across the table from me said, as we laid into our yogurt dessert, that if there's a just God, he will be torturing Hitler for eternity. This is where being people responsible for what they are kicks in and creates hatred. I don't hate Hitler. I don't feel that God torturing Hitler for eternity would be a good, even though he did so much evil. His suffering doesn't improve things in any way. There but for the grace of God go I. If I had been born in Hitler's neonatal body incorporating, like everything he was at that instant, and born into the exact same situation familially and culturally and geopolitically as Hitler. And by my understanding of a world in which causes govern what happens, I would have traced the same course that Hitler did. I don't see how you come up with a basis where, given that beginning that he didn't choose, you get to, oh, well, he's responsible for who he is. So I've come to see people's evil, and I'm not sure I want to, anyway, the whole question of evil. I don't usually attach it to people, but, with Hitler, you can just say, here's a guy who is a lot of terrible things, did a lot of terrible things. I see him as the fruit of the world, which means that certain really unfortunate, what's the word, weaving together of causes over time, produced this thing in that world that was going to eventually lead to this guy standing up there before these throngs in the Nuremberg Square, getting people all revved up to make sure that everybody bowed down to the master race, Deutschland über alles. I've come to see that fruit of the world as a phenomenon like something that we encounter when we watch the movie Yeller, Old Yeller. Now, I don't know what age anybody who's listening to me is, but back in the 80s, I had children growing up, and I watched Old Yeller, I think, more than once with my children. Old Yeller is a dog, and it's a frontierish family, I think in western Texas. Well, actually, it's not so dry as I don't know where they are. And Fess Parker is the father, but the real story is about this boy and this dog. And at a certain juncture, this dog saves the boy from a wild javelina. And as he does so, he gets seriously wounded by the javelina. He kills the javelina, but he saves the boy by. Um, but a javelina is not nothing to tackle. It's big. It's got these whatever you want to call them, tusks, I guess. So he gets kind of carved up and he gets better. I I think I got this right. But the crucial thing I know I got right because I've been thinking about it over the years. I actually, I think in one of my books, write about Old Yeller as how to think about evil. That evil is sort of more like a disease. The people who are uh, uh, doing this kind of evil, like Hitler and like a political leader on the center stage of American politics right now, they're doing they're transmitting the brokenness that they didn't choose to embody, but that's who they are. And with Old Yeller, the metaphor of the disease is that he becomes rabid. So apparently that javelina was rabid, and whatever it was that happened in that fight to the death between Old Yeller and that javelina resulted in the transmission of, I guess it's a bacterium, isn't it, with rabies? And in time, this disease manifests itself. And Old Yeller becomes something different. You know, I said the ugliness we see in human history is not human nature writ large. The Old Yeller who's infected with rabies doesn't show the nature of Old Yeller that we've loved throughout that whole movie. He's such a fine guy, as shown by his willingness to put his own life on the line to save the boy, who would have been killed by the javelina, if I remember that scene. And here he is infected with this brokenness. It doesn't show his nature as we know it. It's a similar kind of thing, only with Hitler and the guy that embodies fascist leader right now. Well, I guess there are several on the planet, not just the American one, but also Putin in Moscow. And I've been saying, you know, also Netanyahu in Israel, you know, to a significant degree. But anyway, I don't hate any of those people. I live with with a wonderful woman. She's a better person than I am in some ways that I believe are important. Her love of people is so ready and so freely given to so many people. I tend to I give it within a smaller circle, but and I'll get to that. I have I don't hate people, but I have difficulty always dealing with some of what they are, and that includes you know, like this major party nominee to be that we've got here in America. I feel I think the main thing I feel is disgust, and I feel outrage. But I understand that Trump is really, you know, the poor SOB. I mean, I've researched some about how did he get to be this way. Not that I, you know, not that I know what exactly he was as a neonate or anything like that, but I've Mary Trump, who's a professional psychologist and a member of that family, whose father was driven, I think, to drink himself to death or commit suicide or both. She's got insights into the forces that shaped her uncle. If I had been born into that situation with that body, I'd be the same thing. So how can I hate him? But at the same time, it is difficult to deal with. And I've struggled with how to deal with that. I'd like to read to you that even though my understanding of how we are the fruit of the world because of the sovereignty of causality in determining how things go, I still wrestle with some of the things that we see, in terms of Old Yeller, what he becomes near the end of the story. He becomes this snarling, kind of ugly face. I mean, is the face of a dog that's in the grip of an evil spirit. I mean, if you're looking at it, he wants to bite the boy. He would kill the boy with his bite if he could. They've isolated him for a while, and the boy is praying that nothing will go wrong, but there has to be a time of quarantine. And then before the time of quarantine arrives, it becomes clear. He has to be put away. He has to be killed. And Fess Parker is off doing whatever it was that took the father away for some months, leaving the boy and his mother and the dog alone out here in the frontier. I don't know why, but anyway, the boy has to take his rifle once it becomes clear this dog has rabies. He's going to die of it. He would kill with it if given a chance. You got to put it out of its misery, and you got to protect the world both. It's not done with hatred. I mean, I feel kind of choked up thinking about what that boy had to do. I've loved some pets, and the idea of having to do that just sort of, it's done in spite of his heart being filled with love. Another Christian saying is hate the sin, but love the sinner. Does that fit with a rabid dog? Is Old Yeller still there? Well, in a sense, he still is there. Love the sinner. But rabies is the sin, and that's got to be put away. So I'm not saying we don't do with the wrongdoers whatever it is that needs to be done. In the case of Hitler, for example, I'm glad he was defeated. I'm glad that he ended up dead. I wish that those military brass that tried to assassinate him in 1944 had succeeded. Well, it saved a lot of lives. And when people do the wrong thing in personal life or in society, we have a lot of reasons for, in some sense, holding them responsible. I think of Dreiker's fellow, child rearing based on natural consequences. If you're raising a kid, you got to do things to shape them. You got to have them see some consequence to their doing the wrong thing, so that they learn not to do the wrong thing. Okay. And in the case of Hitler, we had to raise tens of millions of army of various nations to prevent that rabid master race from destroying even more of what's good in the human world. So I'm not arguing for coddling Okay, well, he couldn't help it. That's just who he was. That's ultimately true, but part of the forces that shape people are the forces that come from society. If there's going to be ostracism or other kinds of punishment, that shapes people. And our task is not to make people suffer. Our task is to do whatever it is that will make the human world better. And figuring out just how do you deal with wrongdoers to do that is a big challenge. I don't think that American society, in which punitiveness and retribution and stuff like that. One of the consequences of this is it's not to say that there should be no punishment. It's to say that the punishment kinds of reasons for punishing are limited in terms of just reasons. Justice. It's okay to do it to teach somebody a lesson. It's okay to do it to deter other people from doing the same thing. If you can establish that doing this, the price that's paid by this suffering is more than balanced by the good for society because of all the people who won't do that terrible thing. Okay, but I think that emotionally and spiritually, the world that I see, particularly in the United States in this era, is punitive in a different sense. It's retributive punishment. And like the lady that I was sitting across the yogurt dessert from, whatever, who wanted Hitler to be tortured for eternity. That's retributive justice. That's the idea that the suffering of the evildoer is itself a good. The good should have positive experience. We want the evil to have a negative experience because they deserve it. They deserve it. If I would be Hitler or Trump, had I been born into their situation, do I deserve it? I don't like to think that I would deserve to be a human monster. Some people become human monsters, and we got to deal with them. But then it is disturbing, and I've got lots of other feelings besides hatred. As I said, I've got some outrage. This is not the way it's supposed to be. This is not the way America is supposed to be. What you're doing to Ukraine, Mr. Putin, is not what any decent leader would be doing. I am outraged by what Putin has entitled himself to do. And I am disgusted with the human being that would make those choices, that kills his opponents, that robs his countrymen blind. What a mess. It's ugly. I care about ugly. I did a talk radio show here in the Shenandoah Valley for hundreds and hundreds of hours over the course of a decade, having interactions with people who right now are lending their political support to, well, I'll just call it a force of fascism. There's lots of ways of describing it, but it's a form of ugliness and destructiveness, and that's what they're doing now. And I've got this relationship with them that I had, and I've by now I kind of know who I am, and one of the things I am is I really don't let go of relationships very easily, very readily. If somebody's ever been important to me, I don't know how to let go. I've sometimes broken off a relationship for what seemed to be good reason, but I never stopped thinking about it. I had a relationship with the conservatives that live in this region, or at least a subset of them that called into my radio show to talk with me about, as I used to put it when I introduced the show each time, questions of meaning and value that we face in our lives. We had, it took a little while to foster the kind of discourse that I was trying to foster. And by the way, this was quite consciously, in my case, trying to foster a very different kind of discourse than I saw Rush Limbaugh, the Godzilla of talk radio, doing across the country. But I was feeling very open to seeing the goodness of a lot of people out in this area that's on the other side of a lot of divides that we have in our country. Republican, Democrat, religious, secular, Yankee, Confederate. You know, I know I didn't get them all parallel, but you can get the idea. I'm on the different. We had some wonderful conversations, and I really came to, I use the word love because it describes something about really how my heart felt about these people. And then I've had a ringside seat because I've continued to live here. I did radio while there's a transformation occurring. I continue to do radio and see the transformation. And I put out op-eds. Now, I ran for Congress here in this district in 2011-12 in this 2-to-1 Republican area. And now I put out every week an op-ed piece, most of them being my attempt to bring people back to the better angels of their nature, because I feel like in some ways I don't recognize the good people that I loved back in the 1990s in the political role that they're playing right now. It's very disturbing to me. I mean, because it's more disturbing to me, I think, than to a lot of the liberal Democrats I know in metropolitan areas, because they don't know the goodness of these people. They see them only in terms of what their politics have been like for a long time. And you can get some really non-compassionate ways of talking about those people from liberals who see them only in terms of their embrace of something, this the moral equivalent of rabies. So given that I have this platform to send messages to these people, given that I can't let go in my heart of feeling a connection with them and wanting them to arise back into their better selves. It's been very disturbing to put all that together with the ugliness that they are furthering. I talked in one particular op-ed that I wrote, which I'm going to be reading to you, was my best effort to, I felt impelled to talk to them about it, and yet I understood that it was a hugely difficult thing to talk with them about. So again, on the horns of that dilemma, I eventually cooked up this message, which says nothing directly about these times, me, the good, decent, conservative people who live in the Shenandoah Valley. Here's what the piece, how the piece reads. And the title of the piece, it ain't all that subtle, but it's still indirect, is When Evil Rises Among a People. For me, the most memorable scene in the memorable 1972 film Cabaret takes place somewhere in the German countryside. The time is the mid-1930s. We see various Germans of this rural area sitting at their tables outdoors next to some country inn, engaged in convivial conversations we don't hear, enjoying good cheer with their friends and neighbors. As the main characters are drinking their wine, a handsome German youth with a beautiful high tenor voice begins singing a song whose first lyrics are, and I apologize, I'm going to try to sing these two lines, but I am the victim 11 years ago of a botched surgery on my vocal cords, and I'm no longer the half-decent tenor I once was. The sun on the meadow is summery warm. The stag in the forest runs free. The melody pierces the heart with its sweetness at first. And the sweetness is really there in that voice. It's as pure as you can imagine a boy of, say, 13, 14, 15. At first, we see only the youth's handsome face. As he sings, the camera pulls back so we gradually see more. Suddenly, startlingly, we see he's wearing a Nazi armband with its swastika. As the singing proceeds, the spirit of the song changes from the lyric sweetness of the opening into the aggressive drumbeat of a military anthem. The lone singer is joined by more and more of the crowd, whose faces have been transformed from the original warm friendliness into a look of angry resolve. The singing ends with Nazi salutes. The name of the song and its repetitive line at the end of each stanza is, "Tomorrow belongs to me." The first time I saw this scene, when the film first came out, this depiction of a human transformation toward darkness gave me gooseflesh. It gives one the chills to see people who shortly before seemed warm and friendly, being transformed right before our eyes into a menace that would soon inflict on the world one of its most unthinkable nightmares. We are all human beings. Our lives are inextricably linked with our membership in our species. What are we to think of our kind once we have witnessed people whom we have previously considered regular, decent people being transformed into willing agents of evil? Lucky are those never to have to witness such a dark transformation in their neighbors. But history has continued to compel many to see such disturbing things that cannot be unseen. I wonder how the Tutsis of Rwanda regard humankind now, in the wake of that terrible genocide their tribe suffered at the hands of their Hutu neighbors a quarter century ago. I guess it's actually 20 years this past week. When people among whom one has lived for years turn into mass murderers, slaughtering one's whole community, what transformation does that bring about in the way we survivors view humankind? Likewise with the Bosnian Muslims, whose Serbian neighbors created camps for raping Bosnian women, and who were murdered by the thousands by people with whom they'd lived side by side for generations. I wonder how those Bosnians perceived humankind in terms of good and evil before that nightmare descended upon them. And what is their image of people now? Thinking about such things in recent times, I recall two memories from earlier in my life. Back in the 1960s, in high school, I acted in the play The Diary of Anne Frank. I was Anne's boyfriend. The last line of the play, taken from the young girl's actual diary, is famous. In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. It's a line that leaves the audience feeling uplifted, at least relatively so, considering that everyone also knows that after writing this hopeful thought in her diary, this lovely person will be sent to her death in a concentration camp. Much later, I had a friend who, as a Jewish boy, had survived the Holocaust. His life had been saved by a good Polish woman who had risked her life and the lives of her family by hiding him from the Nazis for 2 years in a small concealed room with space just for a bed until the Nazi power had been driven out. This friend told me how he'd come to think of humanity. There are three kinds of people, he said. There are those who will do evil no matter what the state of the world around them. And there are those who will do good no matter what. But both of those groups are small. The great majority of people belong to a third group. They will do good when that's how people around them are acting. And they will do evil when the winds of evil are blowing strongly around them. Upon reflection, I can see how my life's work has been about exploring how both Anne Frank and my Holocaust survivor friend are right. My Better Human Story is about how we are born to wholeness, but also how forces in our world, in ways frightening to witness, can turn people toward brokenness. That combination allows me not to hate the people who are sitting in the equivalent of the Bavarian beer garden, stomping their feet, ready to conquer the world and show that the master race is better than everyone. But I don't forget that there but the grace for the grace of God go I. And that's the more fundamental thing. I haven't really worked out how to recover some of what I used to feel about humanity as a whole. It's been a terrible loss to me to be witnessing so much of what I didn't think growing up in the America of the 1950s and 60s that I'd ever see something like this. But there it is. And so I have believing that cause and effect is how people get broken. I have made it a point in my Better Human Story to include a fairly thorough exploration of how brokenness gets transmitted in the world, how somebody like Hitler becomes somebody like Hitler, and so on. How people who could talk to me in the beautiful ways that some of them talked to me back in the 1990s, it made me really admire the values, their way of holding their sacred values. to understand how they got moved into a place of brokenness where they support something which is really quite demonstrably driving things in the opposite of those beautiful values they articulated back in the 1990s. I've done a fair amount of work on that, and I think, though I'm not satisfied with what I've come up with, I have fleshed out the picture a whole lot, and I invite people to go. Well, first of all, you can follow me because I'm going to keep working on this stuff. And you can go to my website, abetterhumanstory.org, from which, by the way, I've just been reading that piece, where I've got a whole bunch of the messages I've sent out there into this very Trump-loving area. But this was written in 2019. That's when it was written. So it was into the Trump world. But there are other things that were already evident about how they were getting moved in some dangerous directions, and my struggles to understand how that is and how America, it's a systemic problem. The problem isn't just on the right, and that's a whole nother thing, that this force that has exploited the brokenness and helped turn people who were committed to Christian values into supporting somebody who's the opposite of Christian values. That's part of, that's been happening for a generation, we can say, and I've been exploring it. So if you go to a betterhumanstory.org, you can find a lot of stuff to flesh all that out in a very systematic way, and also piece by piece in other respects. There are ways, for example, of understanding the spirit of fascism that's got to do with how brokenness begets brokenness. One can observe, and here we get to, it's not a religious way of getting to truth, it's a secular way of gathering evidence and drawing conclusions. If you look at the behavior of fascist forces over the last century in a variety of countries, one can't help coming to the conclusion that there is something in, I'm going to call it the spirit of fascism, that's driven to generate conflict. Often that conflict, but not always, the insistence on conflict is also insistence at the level of the conflict of a force of arms, of war. If you look at sort of how the civilized human world, particularly the most advanced parts of it, forgive the advance if that offends, I'm not going to go into how that word might fit, but say Europe in this century, the past 100 years, we see that the force of war has a major tool in fascist leadership. You go to 1939 and you have a Europe that somebody chose to put the continent at war. It was not ambiguous, which side wanted war. The Nazis came to power in 1933, and from 1933 to 1939, there is a transformation of the country that's geared toward conquest and war. And meanwhile, on the side of England, for example, you got Winston Churchill being all by himself in the wilderness saying, hey, it looks like something's rising over there that's going to be a threat to us. We got to do something about it. It's clear the English chose no war, even to the peril of the survival of their nation, which barely made it through just by the skin of their teeth after ignoring Churchill to to the time when finally he becomes their wartime prime minister, replacing Chamberlain, continually not choosing war. But war came, and the side that chose war was the side of fascism. I think you can look at the American Civil War in similar terms, but I've got a lot that has been, that I've written about how the force of the slave power has a lot in common with fascism. I mean, founded on slavery and domination, and having a certain kind of lawlessness, like the secession that had not been authorized. Anyway, I'm not going to go there. Let's look, rather than going back from 1939 to the 1850s and into the firing on Fort Sumter, where there is a fascistic-ish force that's driving the nation into a nightmare of a war. They chose war. I mean, Lincoln felt he had a constitutional duty, and I think probably constitutionally he did. His arguments are always very strong. He felt he had a constitutional duty to resist the insurrection of the insurrectionists in Charleston Harbor who fired upon Fort Sumter and who were gathering an army to fight to make their secession stick. Again, the other side didn't want a war. And then, so coming forward from after Hitler falls, and well, we got another totalitarian regime that we got to deal with in the Soviet Union, but let's skip that. Europe was divided for a long time. I'm not going to say it's a zone of peace, but the war that we had was a Cold War, but we come up to 2022, and in the course of that time, Europe has created a substantial achievement in the direction of organizing the world for peace. I mean, the European Union for cooperation, and NATO with its expanding membership. And then we've got this fascistic regime headed by Vladimir Putin, formerly of the KGB, and he plunges, he shatters that zone of peace and plunges the continent back into the war of all against all. And by the way, the idea of there being a war of all against all in the interactive system of civilized societies, that's at the heart of that book back there. I mean, that is what civilization inevitably unleashes, is a war of all against all. But I'm not sure I should go any further in that direction right now. The point is that brokenness begets brokenness. And we look at these fascistic leaders, and there is a brokenness about them having to do with various components that you can identify. Not all of them in every single one of them, but the lust to dominate and the insistence on conflict is the thing that the specific thing I'm talking about. The insistence on conflict. They choose conflict. Now, there's been a fascistic force rising in America, which I saw in part with the rise of Rush Limbaugh, and then reinforced by the rise of Newt Gingrich when they swept in 1994, and he becomes the Speaker of the House. And then the propagandistic phase of this thing taking off still further with Fox News in 1997. I saw that stuff for what it was. It wasn't until W's presidency, with another propagandist, Karl Rove, being Bush's brain, that I understood that this thing was bigger than I thought. And as time went on, it became more fascistic than I thought. The way they lied us into a war, they chose war on the basis of false accusations. Hitler did the same thing about saying Poland started it in September 1st, 1939. I mean, you look at Putin and he finds excuses of why the Ukrainian Nazis are the ones that are requiring him to do what he's doing. Something rising. But when it got to Donald Trump, some of the components that you see in say Hitler are not in every fascistic spirited leader. And Trump does not have the same insistence on international conflict or on exterminating people. He's not murderous, or at least this is my diagnosis. And I've tried to look at the parallels and to be completely honest about what the differences are. And the not murderous is an important thing, and it's there. But still, the insistence on conflict can definitely be seen. You've probably read articles which eventually people started noticing that whatever came up, Trump earned the sobriquet. I wish I could master words better these days. He's called the divider in chief. And wherever any kind of issue comes up, it would become not a basis for us to work together to achieve something we can agree on for the common good. He never took that approach about anything. It was always trying to make something a matter of dividing his base against the people, the people who love him against the people who hate him. More and more divided as the years went by. Quite remarkably, his insistence on conflict is so pervasive that even when the nation was confronted with a once-in-a-century pandemic, I mean, somebody who grew up in the America I grew up in, Eisenhower and Truman before that, and Kennedy and Johnson, and even Nixon and Ford and Carter and Reagan and the first Bush, all these things, all these places where you knew that the president was going to respond to the pandemic like FDR in the face of the Great Depression. And then in 1941, after Pearl Harbor, the nation comes, the leader brings the people together in an emergency and mobilizes them to surmount that emergency, whether it's got to do with creating a civilian conservation corps, or it's got to do with building thousands and thousands of tanks and signing up to serve in the U.S. military and saying that this act that will live forever in the pages of infamy, the whole country comes together. And that's how it was even in 9/11. The two parties unified for a little while. And by the way, people don't remember well enough how that unity got sundered. It got sundered by what was already a visible rising force of fascism, because division and conflict is what the fascist thrives on. And Donald Trump what didn't he turn into something to fight over? Vaccinations? The CDC? Demonizing even Dr. Fauci, who in Japan would be considered a national treasure? I mean, the guy who is admired worldwide, who tells us how to deal with some things about how to deal with the pandemic, wasn't the way the divider in chief wanted to deal with the pandemic. No rallying the country, always dividing the country into the people who love him and follow him wherever he leads. People who think the election is stolen when it isn't stolen. Even an election can't get us to agree about who's the legitimate president. First time in our history. So I think I should have established the proposition, at least to a plausible degree, that fascism, the spirit of fascism, is one that brings with it the insistence on conflict. So then the question arises, why is that? What causes that? And I have an explanation for it. I think it's substantially right. It's got to do with something I've been looking at since I was in my late teens, and when I was sort of a follower of Freud's. He's the closest thing to an intellectual mentor, other than my dad, who was the big one. But Dad didn't impart an ideology, he imparted a quest for truth. But Freud talked about the conflict between the superego and the id. The superego being this thing that is internalized from the outside world. The introjected father is one of the components, and the moral teachings of the society go into shaping this superego. And the id, meanwhile, is that core of human nature. Only when I talk about it, I have a lot more love for it than Freud. That's key to the difference that I eventually came to about Freud, is he was looking at the repressive society he lived in, and he was looking at the brokenness of the people who were living in this broken society. And he was drawing conclusions about human nature that My Better Human Story is directly a refutation of. I don't, but when I wrote a 1,600-page dissertation version of that, I go into some length about how Freud's civilization and his discontents completely misses it. But Freud focuses our attention on a vital spot, which is that we're born with a certain set of needs or impulses, or what the pursuit of happiness might mean if we expressed our nature. And then we have to internalize what our culture requires us to internalize in order to be the members of our society that our society insists on. Now, that theory, I still don't know how much, if any, I'm going to go deep into it anyway, but it says that when you take a step out of the natural order, and the way we were the first species ever to do that on this planet, you're going to plunge into disorder, and that disorder will unleash a systemic dynamic. It's an anarchic, unregulated order. It's anarchic. It generates a war of all against all. That it generates a selective process. Isn't governed by the nature of the creature. It's built into the nature of the disorder. And the disorder is an inevitable part of breaking out of the order that 3.5 billion years of life's evolution created for everything. It's the first breakout from that order in the history of life. So a systemic dynamic generates a selective process, which says that only those cultural options that can survive that can prevail in a war of all against all get to survive and spread. So, all kinds of other options might be out there, but if they can't survive in this anarchic world where things like what Putin's doing to Ukraine can happen, and have happened since the beginning of civilization, in an accelerating degree, leading to the formation of empires in all the places where civilization emerged in pristine form all over the planet. There's a selective process that says that we're going to get a very non-random group of societies out of the vast multitude of what seem to be possibilities. Only those that prevail in a war of all against all get to survive and spread. So we've got societies that have been selected for how much power they're able to bring to that war of all against all. And that is very much a function of what its members are like. So the selective process is also selecting for certain psychological structures and certain kinds of morality that are conducive to generating a lot of power out of your members. And it isn't just one thing, but it isn't everything. The peace-loving and the gentle may not survive in this world, even though that's just as much of it, maybe even more of an expression of human nature than the bellicose warriors that we see, the spirit of the gangster that rises to control the Nile Valley and the Tigris Euphrates and so on across the planet. It's non-random and it's not a function of the nature of the creature, which is another way of saying why I feel called to have compassion upon the brokenness of the human species. I mean, even people like Putin, even the terrible things that happen, we as a species have plunged into an inevitable process, which has been very painful. And it's generated societies in which the spirit of the gangster gets a disproportionate say, which means that we are civilized peoples have been required to internalize demands from their society that are there only because the ways of power are getting selected for. The ways of power are far from identical with what kind of culture would you want, how kind of society, how would it look if it was designed maximally to meet human needs. Not like what we see. Not like what we've seen in history for the most part. But that's what you get when you... So one of the ways in which brokenness begets brokenness is that people are internalizing that introjected superego from the outside world and having to deal with the conflict between them. Lucky is the person whose the morality that they incorporate is compassionate and wise. There's a big spectrum of how kids get raised, how cultures raise kids, and all kinds of, and you can sort of create a spectrum from those who are given moral teachings of this is how you're supposed to be, that are compatible with doing a whole lot of meeting of basic human needs, not real incompatible with the pursuit of happiness. And on the other end of the spectrum, there are people who get taught your needs are evil, where the society wants the growing individual to make war upon their desires and needs and impulses because they're forbidden. Because what was conducive to power was, some ferocity or something something very repressed. I don't think it's coincidence that the Europe that produced civilization and its discontents was the late 19th century Europe that was conquering the world and turning a whole lot of weaker societies into colonies with an imperialistic spirit. There's a domination rather than a working to heart. There is conflict inside. And the more serious the conflict, the less able the person will be to find ways of reconciling the needs that want to get met and the requirements that the society says also should be met. Which is why I think you can find a significant correlation in all these examples of a fascist force that's supported by a mass of people, that the people who rally are people who've internalized a particularly harsh morality. If you analyze the culture of the South or of fundamentalist religion, the kind of Christianity that prevails in the South, you find that there are a lot of signs that the morality is very harsh. There's a lot of punitiveness. There's not a lot of compassion. There's a lot of tightness. The more people are, in a sense, at war with themselves, which is a reflection of the war at the intersocietal level that's selecting for the brokenness of a harsh morality being characteristic of societies that are good at harnessing power, in certain ways anyhow. I'm fairly familiar with the culture that I live in, the one that I've seen a lot of beauty in back when I talked with him in the 90s. But I also, while I was seeing that beauty, I was also seeing some of the harshness of it. I mean, it's just that like there's no negotiation available, and there's there ain't a whole lot of forgiveness, even though Christianity is supposed to be about forgiveness. But there isn't a whole lot at the far reaches of this, and there's a whole lot of top-down control. You don't let what's underneath express itself. And an example I can give that I talked about on the radio was that my son was going to the elementary school here, and I started hearing stories about things that happened at the drinking fountain, and the school enforced that nobody could be drinking from the fountain for more than 5 seconds. Now, I went to public schools in Michigan, in Minnesota. Um, we didn't ever have any rule like that. There wasn't any need for any rule like that. And I call that that into question because I had some other examples also about how the moral structure of this very conservative part of America is very top down and really wants to suppress what's underneath, whether it be elementary school kids or some other underneath. And I got phone calls to that show, somebody saying, "You're calling for anarchy." They thought that if there weren't all these rules controlling the kids and being enforced on them, making them do what they needed to do, and not having them walk around in lines and stuff like that for certain events, anyhow, unnecessarily, as far as I could see. If you didn't do that, it would be anarchy, and the kids would be just running wild. That's a kind of lack of integration. The idea that there is no way of reconciling the harsh demands with the inborn needs. So the conflict, I think, begins there. And a lot of good Freudians have done a lot of very good work looking at, in some sense, the fascistic spirit and making the connection between the harshness of what's been internalized and the fascistic authoritarian bent. There's a conflict inside that's very painful if you confront it inside. And what the Freudians' gift to understanding is that the idea of projection, I mean, it's not the only gift. And again, I disagree with Freud about a lot, but the idea that there is such a thing as projection. If people have an irreconcilable conflict that's sort of part of their moment to moment experience, because they can't escape that they've got human needs, and they can't escape that they've internalized the demands of a harsh morality that their culture has imposed on them. To avoid that painful internal war, they project that brokenness out into the world. They do some of the stuff of fascism. First of all, they insist on conflict. You know, there is a major political party in America right now where the supporters of that party seem completely untroubled by the fact that their party has no program whatsoever of saying, I think we should enact this and we should do that. We should move the country forward. This is how we can make a better America. Let's see if we can actually get this stuff done so the world will be better. There's no sense of working together to achieve something good. There wasn't even a platform in the year 2020 from this party. I think that's the first time in American history a party has gone into an election simply saying, whatever he says. No vision of moving things together. The point isn't getting positive things done. The path of cooperation is shunned. It's the path of conflict that appeals. Make an issue out of everything, please. Because conflict is part of the experience and it can't be faced within. So, for example, when it comes to the racism of the South, there's a woman named Lillian Smith who grew up in Mississippi and wrote a book. She was well trained in psychoanalytic thinking. And was able to use its tools, I think, quite well in her book, Killers of the Dream. I haven't read it in a very long time, but I've made use of it in my books. She's very good about the meanings to the white Americans of the blacks. And projection is a major part of that. There's sexual parts that have to do with how certain classes of white children were raised with sensuous experience with mammies. And there's a projection onto the blacks of impulses that the internalized morality condemns. They seem a lot to be sexual. I should read that chapter. She has a chapter called The Rich Man to the Poor Man, too, because there's a way in which there are two different strata of white people in the South, and she talks about the manipulative bargain that the fascist power at the top forms with the conned whites at the bottom, so that they will think of their us versus them as being we whites against those blacks, rather than we people who are struggling to have enough wealth to live decently and who are struggling to have enough political power to have some say in our society, that we could make that the blacks on this side and the not ruling whites on this side really have a lot of common interests in a society where there's an elite that controls the whole thing, a fascistic elite that, again, I think I can show. I mean, the word fascistic, I use it to mean to cover like if you can cover 70% of the requisite territory about authoritarianism and about scapegoating and about domination and all kinds of stuff like that, if you can cover enough of it, I'm going to equate Putin with Hitler for these purposes. And the slave power fits well enough. And Lillian Smith shows that the underlying all that con game, there's also the ways in which sexually repressed white males, with their creation of almost an angelic white womanhood, to be put on a pedestal, on a column, pedestal, and to be venerated and protected against these black men who we will lynch if they even look cross-eyed at a white woman. These black men who embody the sexual impulses that the culture comes down very hard on, and that maybe, I don't remember how much, I mean, I would just suspect that if the white woman is up there on that pedestal in an angelic form, that there's going to be, well, obviously there was a sexual connection of sorts because all these dominant white men did have children. But I'm guessing, and I think Lillian Smith indicates that not only did they project their sexuality onto the black man and punish the black man for their sexuality, but also you find out that the Y chromosome in, I think, a big fraction of African Americans is a European Y chromosome. In other words, these guys were not only worshiping white women and protecting them from the so-called, savage, rapist, black sexual animal, but they were raping black women, getting their Y chromosome into that line. There's a lot of brokenness going on there. But anyway, conflict. The relationship between the white power structure and the black people was one of terrorizing and oppressing and exploiting. It's a conflictual relationship in which the value of the other is denigrated, that actually putting the other guy down, dealing with the other guy through hostility, expresses something. It's the insistence on conflict, because conflict has been built in. It's not reconcilable because the morality was too harsh. And fascism does that. It grows out of that territory. If you look at the child rearing practices that led to a nation of people who are thrilled to wear uniforms and in one as one in unison make the Nazi salute and yell "Sieg Heil," and spend years greeting each other, "Heil Hitler." If you're looking for what kind of child rearing leads to that, it's very harsh. At least that is what you see in some good psychological literature. At least I think it's good. And I've looked. I have a book back there, Out of Weakness. Let me see if I can bring that up. It's quite relevant here. Out of Weakness. Here it is. So Out of Weakness is about how brokenness begets brokenness. And a part of this thing is the need for conflict, because the evolution of civilization inevitably caused harsh moralities to get selected for, they make for aggressive societies because people project their internal conflict, which is too painful to tolerate. Why do fascist regimes insist on conflict? There are a lot of people who have conflicts inside that they can't deal with. You could deal if the distance between the two sides was like 10 yards. But if it's the whole football field, the conflict is going to be there as an experienced reality, whether you are willing to identify the reality of what it's about or not. There's going to be a conflict, and therefore, and if you're not willing to deal with it inside, like good psychotherapy, would ideally lead people to be able to reconcile them. But you probably would have to modify the harsh morality to get there. And people are locked in often because they've been taught by an authoritarian culture. You believe this. You can't reconfigure what the teachings of the religion are or what the political commitments are. You stay in line. So you're going to experience conflict. You can't experience it inside without it being too painful. You're not. There's no real choice about whether to experience conflict, but you can choose to externalize it. And so, for the Southern whites that ran the Jim Crow thing and lynched 2,000 or 3,000 men over the course of some decades, that's one way of externalizing it. The other group is the repository of evil that we will fight. We get to fight, and we externalize we're the good guys and they're evil by denying the real internal battle. But that's how brokenness begets brokenness. There's a book called The Authoritarian Personality, or actually it's 2 volumes. It was done after World War II. That really confirms a lot of this. But I think that the most vivid portrait of how brokenness begets brokenness in explaining how you get to a population ready to embrace Nazism is a book by Alice Miller called For Your Own Good. And it describes what she calls the poisonous pedagogy of German child rearing practices. And it's not just, like your unfortunately abusive parents, one by one here and there, dealing with the natural child in such a harsh way. The authorities in this poisonous pedagogy, according to Alice Miller, are actually teaching the parents of Germany for generations. I can't remember how far back she goes, maybe the 19th century anyway, leading up to the generation of the people who made such good Nazis. It's really, my kid having to leave the drinking fountain as soon as he gets to 5 seconds, or have a teacher chastise him, that flavor permeates this poisonous pedagogy that created the Germans. In my interpretation of the rise of the Nazis, I include very much not just that, but the fracturing of the culture by all the traumas German society underwent from 1914 to 1933. But in America, we haven't had those kinds of traumas. And I've looked at how this particular political party's base that is 2/3 of my neighbors that I live among in the Shenandoah Valley, how they came to embrace a fascistic spirit. And I know with reasonable certainty that there's a vulnerability created in them for having a very distorted picture of reality, for one thing, because of the projections and because they believe what the fascistic leaders do to manipulate them. There's the fact that the superego is so hostile, relatively speaking, and so insistent on complete obedience. There's a vulnerability there that enables a fascistic power that might be ruling the country to enlist a lot of those people into a system where they've externalized their hatreds and angers. I mean, the natural creature is going to be enraged to be so oppressed. There's going to be rage and pain down there. And it's not going to be wished away, but it can be redirected. You need a fight, you need an enemy, fascism always gives it to you. The blacks in the South, the Jews in the world of the Nazis, the baby-killing liberals you have to say the Republic from, in the political world that's arisen here as the political party that they have traditionally aligned themselves with has been taken over since, say, the first Bush presidency. That was not a fascistic party, but the transformation started to happen. And you end up with the exploitation of that vulnerability. People who need a conflict, given an enemy, having their pain and rage directed at something that isn't responsible for it. There's a Jewish joke I like a lot. In my little family, my wife and me, we have lines we use frequently, and one of them comes from this joke. So there's a big hulking German soldier walking back down the road from the front where Germany has surrendered. He's really, really unhappy. And there's this little Jewish man walking along the road coming in his direction. And he grabs the Jew by the collar and he says, "Who's responsible for this war, for our losing this war?" And the Jew looks up and he says, "The Jews," knowing that that's the answer that's required, just like the step and fetch it black person learns how to talk grovel to white people that you can see in the literature and in the movies. The soldier, hearing him say, can admit that the Jews are at fault for all the problems, is satisfied. And then the Jew says, "And the bicycle riders?" And the German looks puzzled. "Why the bicycle riders?" And the Jew says, "Why the Jews?" Hope you like that joke. I do. The projection onto other people is sort of a global problem. And wherever people are doing projection, the psychoanalysts basically had a good insight, which is it's got to do with not being able to deal with what's inside. So you got to pretend, you got to decide to see it someplace else. So that's why Fascism always insists on conflict. Brokenness begets brokenness. The brokenness of the war of all against all, that means that we're going to get cultures shaped by the demands of power, which means we're going to have brokenness inside people because the society's power is maximized by things that are not particularly harmonious with the goal of meeting human needs. So that internalization is a kind of conflict, is a broken, and then it aligns with fascism to the extent to which that brokenness is too great to overcome by finding reconciliation. You know, the teachings of Christianity are all about reconciliation, all about dealing with other people the way you'd want to be dealt with, even going so far as to love your neighbor as yourself. The opposite of creating enemies, and the opposite of hating enemies. But fascism is a vehicle for hatred and conflict and domination. And that's why when you've got this whole overarching thing about what kind of societies shape us because of what social evolutionary selective force shaped the societies, you end up with brokenness. And the brokenness feeds back into the brokenness because somebody, well, let's take this fascistic leader that threatens to inflict a lot of brokenness on America right now. What do we know? Well, we know that his father was a prominent member of New York City's Ku Klux Klan. And the firm was found guilty of violating the civil rights of black people in their real estate business. We know that he thinks of shithole countries. We know that he cultivates images of immigrants that are demonization. He's doing exactly what the Nazis did about dehumanization. They're animals, he says. It's an old playbook. It comes naturally to somebody who's been absorbing some really broken treatment in the family. The kind of treatment that drove the brother to death made him a person that creates conflict, always. And embraces the guy who launched the war on Ukraine. One should begin to see that when there are patterns like this, you can see, from the base to this leader to the Putin regime, and you could go on and on, that it makes sense to talk about a spirit of fascism, which is an expression of a spirit of brokenness, that it will make enemies and war rather than friends and peace. It will create injustices rather than justice. It will bring hatred out of people rather than their love. One question that I've asked in the op-eds that I've put out, I said, I took, this is, I don't know, before the pandemic, I think, I wrote to the very red population of the district where I appear once a week in an op-ed. I said, what's your relationship like with, and I went through a list of people and, or groups of people, blacks, Hispanics, Democrats, anyways, a long list of people. And in every case, the relationship between their political party, the one that they're enthusiastically supporting, and those other people, is one of antagonism. I mean, it's really very easy to show. It was back then. I don't think it'd be any harder now. So I also, in that piece, I don't remember entirely how it got laid out. I'm going to be sharing more of my op-ed pieces because I deal systematically in those more than here, where I love to improvise and hope that that works. I asked the question, what does your political party lead you to deal with love or to regard with love? I don't remember how I put it, but basically, it's a world that's not characterized by love. It's a world that's become very atypically for an American political party, consistently taking the broken half of our various dichotomies: hatred, not love; conflict, not cooperation; domination, not mutual respect. And you could keep on going, and in some of my writings I have. It's really quite consistent, and it's really quite extraordinary in terms of the history of American politics. But we've seen this kind of thing before, and it tells us something about how brokenness begets brokenness. In the live stream I did on Saturday, which you can find in my YouTube library easily, what did I start with? Oh, I'll come up with that in a minute. I talked about the reality of coherent forces of brokenness and wholeness that exist in the world. That calling this pattern fascism is actually a helpful broadening of how we understand what it is that's risen. But there are even deeper and broader ways of looking at this that really illuminate the whole human story since we started on the path of civilization. Fascism versus democracy, and if you look on my website, abetterhumanstory.org, look for fascism. I've written about, all the ways in which democracy versus fascism really aligns with wholeness versus brokenness. And I say also, it's worthwhile calling these forces, they're coherent forces that consistently work to either make the human world worse or make the human world better. And they're battling which way we're going to go. And really, if you look at the dynamics of that battle, it really parallels what traditional understanding has regarded as a battle between good and evil. So democracy versus fascism can be seen in an evolutionary perspective as a contemporary manifestation of a battle that's as old as when we plunged into that anarchy 10 or 12,000 years ago. It wasn't like immediate war of all against all, but it inevitably arose. This problem is inherent in becoming a civilization-creating species. That's what I claim that book proves. Any creature on any planet, anywhere in the cosmos, billions of galaxies, billions of stars in each galaxy, many, many planets around many, many stars. Any creature that steps onto the path of civilization, getting out of the natural order by inventing its own way of life because it's got an unprecedented level of creative intelligence, not because there's anything wrong with its nature. It doesn't know where it's going when it starts to change the rules of its life by planting things it used to gather or penning things it used to hunt. It doesn't know that this is the beginning of something that's going to gather like a snowball, generating the selection for the ways of power. But that is, in fact, the inevitable outcome. I think I show that. That's the idea that changed my life, 1970. And I've been building on it. I just think that if we understood that what we're up against is, and that's the name of that book, what we're up against is a systemic force. We are better creatures than we have thought ourselves to be. And I try to stay in touch with that because, Old Yeller, um, a wonderful dog that we by nature, I mean, I don't know how wonderful we are, but better than we would look, because the spirit of the gangster has been automatically gets a disproportionate say once we step into that honor. You can see that whenever we've had anarchy in our world, like Lebanon a while back and Somalia a while back. Each time, warlords are essentially gangsters, the ones who get the disproportionate say. Not because Lebanese are basically that kind of people, not because the Somalis are that kind of people, but that because the spirit of the gangster is what inevitably rises to the top in an anarchic situation. And so if I think about how do I feel about humanity, when I'm dealing with some of this outrage and disgust, some things that I see, I try to hold on to the more fundamental truth of the matter, which is, through no fault of our own, we're sort of tragic heroes. My undergraduate dissertation was called a Psychology of Heroic Tragedy. So I've thought a lot about what the tragic hero is. And one of the patterns in it is that the very virtue that makes the tragic hero great becomes the means of his undoing. And I won't, illustrate that in Shakespeare and Greek and stuff, but it can be done. And we humans, we're rising. We're with the chimpanzees, and divided 5-7 million years ago, and we're gradually, unfolding into a somewhat different kind of a creature. From the chimpanzees are on their path, we're on our path. Our path is becoming increasingly cultural. We're getting smart, and the more we rely on culture, which we can generate more than the other creatures. Chimps have got some culture, but not like us. The more we can, our strategy becomes one of surviving by utilizing our brains and creating culture. The more we're rewarded for getting even bigger brains, and we get smarter and smarter. Lucy's almost 4 million years ago, and she's got a brain that's not really much bigger than the chimpanzees. And then by the time you get to Homo erectus and all these hominids they're finding, we find out that the human brain kept on growing. I think that the thing is we had chosen culture as our path. We're cultural. We learn how to control fire. We paint on the caves. We make good stone tools that make us better hunters, and a variety of things. But we're still living in a niche in which we evolved biologically in terms of size, structure, means of subsistence. So we're getting to be bigger headed. We're getting to be smarter because there are rewards for the people who can learn language, for example. Our physiognomy changes as we become more and more reliant on language for our social life, and we survive by being social animals. That's where Freud basically missed the boat with civilization and its discontents. He thought we were by nature incapable, that we need some kind of harsh thing to civilize us enough so that we can function in a society. That generation, I find, really didn't understand the implications of evolution. We were social before we were human. No problem about us functioning as members of society. He was way off. He was mistaken Victorian Europe for the typical society. Hunting-gathering bands would have been the typical society for, whatever you want to start calling them, human hunting-gathering bands. And before that, primate bands, all of them social. But at a certain point, though evolution doesn't look forward. There's a lot of ways you can illustrate that, but one way is evolution created a really smart creature comparatively, creative, able to come up with solutions to problems that, lo and behold, are capable of creating a whole new kind of life form, one that's not been shaped by natural selection. No, it's a life form that's been shaped by creative choices that the creature has made. It's once removed from biological evolution. And it unleashes a force that there's no way that creature could have anticipated. The tragic hero doesn't have to be anything other than intelligent enough to do the stuff that we have done in transforming ourselves from hunting-gathering people to civilized people. Once you're that intelligent and you take that fateful step, that's enough to put it all in motion. You create a situation which has never existed. Life has been evolving for 3.5 billion years and creating a highly regulated system where the lion and the zebra and the grass work together to create a perpetual motion machine while they're devouring each other. That's what gets created by the evolutionary process. And so that the order of how wolves and sheep interact is consistent with the survival pattern, not just for the wolves, but for the sheep as well, so they don't overgraze. Things are in balance. Very important concept. I think part of the reason why the secular worldview has been slow to understand the implications of the evolutionary process is that that Darwinian thinking focused on the competitive aspect, maybe because it was a capitalist society, an imperialist society, I don't know. But it's the more concrete level. But the bigger level is there's an order here that regulates the interactions among all the actors in the thing. But as soon as the creature, not because it's evil, not because it's warlike, not because of it doesn't have to be any of those things, no matter what its nature is. If it enters into this situation where there's nothing to regulate the interactions among the things, you're going to generate a war of all against all, a selection for the ways of power, the internalization of painful demands from the society. The unleashing of a force in which brokenness begets brokenness. And I really commend to your attention, if you go to my website, A Better Human Story, I recommend a piece called The Discernible Reality of a Force of Evil. It can be discerned, and you don't have to call it evil. And I know a lot of people have trouble because they think that I know they know what they mean. Here's what I mean: a coherent force that consistently works to make the human world more broken. And I can show that the step onto the path of civilization unleashes such a force. You can call it what you want, but it acts a lot like how traditionally in our civilization the force of evil has been understood. And I have my reasons for thinking that it's a good word to use. But I also have a lot of experience of people say, oh, no such thing in the world. Well, actually, let me show it to you. There's another piece you could look for, Pure Case, where there's another way of showing the reality of such a coherent force. You can call it what you want, but it does do things that are consistently making the world more broken, which is what I've said is the case with the force of brokenness. I mean, the force of fascism. It's a manifestation. It has a lot in common with what the force of brokenness in that war of all against all created in all the 6 places where civilization emerged, not transplanted, but from the ground up. I mentioned before the Nile, the Tigris Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow, Mesoamerica, and the Peruvian whatever's highlands. Those are the 6 places, and all those places, there's a process that I think substantially shows different forms, but a lot of commonality that you can subsume under the force, the spirit of the gangster. And that's what fascism is. We're dealing with the spirit of the gangster. And Putin is a human monster, but I don't hate him because he's old Yeller. I mean, he disgusts me, what he does to his enemies. Navalny he kills, Prigozhin he kills. Maybe the richest man in the world, while his people could really use a lot of help outside Moscow and Petersburg, I guess, is still pretty stark and bleak out there in Russia. He doesn't care a bit about the Russian people. He just sends them into the meat grinders in Ukraine. I mean, it's really ugly. But there, but for the grace of God, go I. I haven't worked out how not to be disgusted and angry, but I would never want God to punish any of these guys for, eternity. There, but for the grace of God, go I. We are all the fruit of the world. And the task we have is simply to do what we need to do in terms of fighting against this destructive force that inevitably emerged with civilization, and which is getting transmitted through the human world in ways that brokenness creates brokenness. So that's, is there more that I should add about the not hating? I would love to be more fully open in my heart to the love of, love thine enemies, whether I don't really like thinking of, but, I think that the political force that my neighbors are supporting really needs to be defeated and driven into oblivion. Not them. I hope that they're salvageable in some way, but, the good is what democracy represents, and this upcoming election really calls out to be seen as an election between democracy and fascism. I've been making the contrast between politics as usual in America. The original intra-party battle that I got to witness was 2 rounds of Eisenhower versus Stevenson in 52 and 56. Both of these guys are really good men. Their contest was not good versus evil. But we've gotten to the point right now in America where we are fighting for democracy against fascism. And fascism is a coherent force that consistently works to make the human world worse. And so all the things that the force of democracy, with President Biden as inevitably the guy who needs to be elected president if American democracy is going to survive. I mean, that is just the only option. If what we're concerned about is to protect the good, and we recognize that the system of constitutional democracy represents the good in this contest, because it is the people having power over who gets power. It is power being used in accordance with law rather than lawlessness. So that's, we are all the fruit of the world, but we do make choices. And anybody who wants to think of themselves as aligned with the good, who's in touch with the realities of really what the forces are at work in America at this time in the political realm, really to protect the good, you got to vote for the people who represent democracy. And even though we should not hate our countrymen, or even this human monster who so many people are following, we need to defeat them. It's old Yeller in a whole new form. when the father comes home from his travels and he finds out all that's happened in his absence, the thing with the javelina, the dog, the wonderful dog saving the boy's life, getting badly wounded in the process, and healing, but only to then show that he has been infected with the hydrophobe. Fess Parker, who played Davy Crockett memorably in my boyhood, and Daniel Boone on TV, he's the father here. He says to the boy, he recognizes that what he had to do with old Yeller, whom he loved, was difficult. But he praised the boy for the character he's shown by doing what he had to do. And the line that has lived on in my family is, sometimes a man's got to do what a man's got to do. And it's true. I think I'll be back to talk a little bit more about how this problem in America, that we've gotten to this point where democracy itself is threatened in a way that I didn't grow up thinking what could happen here, as the old expression goes. I'll read an op-ed piece that I wrote called "Cry the Benighted Country," about how this development, the rabies virus may be over there, one part of the body politic. But the crisis is a function of failures of every part of the body politic. And when that book, What We're Up Against, which you can, by the way, read from cover to cover for nothing on my website, abetterhumanstory.org. I've got it there as a PDF. That book shows that this is a systemic problem. And when I launched that book, I launched it with publishing as widely as I had access to at the time, an op-ed called "Cry the Benighted Country." That's sort of a takeoff on a title that maybe people don't know these days. Cry the Beloved Country, about the terrible situation with apartheid in South Africa, but, written, I don't know, 70 some years ago. Anyway, Cry the Benighted Country, if you want. I'm going to be coming back shortly to read that piece. I want to take a little break, and I want that to be a freestanding piece. We're not in a position to blame any one piece of us for the brokenness that's gained so much power in our country that we're not sure what kind of country we're going to be, whether we're on the side of the leader of the free world or aligned with the fascistic regime in Moscow, a few years hence. It's a systemic thing. I think that so many things are connected with so many things that we probably should almost always imagine that it is not an isolated phenomenon. It is taking place in a context. And the context here is that the conservative America having been taken over by a fascistic force, is that liberal America failed to do what it needed to do. The press failed to do what it needed to do. And the American people failed to do what it needed to do. That the force of brokenness made real inroads of different kinds in different parts of the system, leading to this much greater power for a fascistic future possibility than most of us would ever have thought to witness. So I hope you'll come back and take a look with me not too long from now. Thank you.